morning. So grateful that you could be here to worship our God with us this morning and to sing songs of praise. I heard something recently on the internet that I haven't had a chance to look up and see if it's true or not, but maybe you can look it up and see that whenever people sing together, their hearts begin to beat at the same rhythm. And I don't know if that's true, but it's a really nice thought if it is true. There's a reason why God has us sing and to be one together. And so thank you for participating and worshiping our God with us this morning. If you'd like to open to Proverbs chapter 12, we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 12 through 14 this morning, where Solomon teaches us what it looks like if we are well-rounded. Now, some of you might be thinking that, you're pretty well-rounded, but that's not what he's talking about here. And of course, it's nice to be the person who's the athlete, scholar, all-around, helpful, fix-it-all buddy to everybody, but that, of course, is not what he's talking about here either. He's talking about a more spiritual kind of well-roundedness, a spirit that is well-rounded. And he's going to show us, each chapter kind of has a different perspective on this. And chapter 12, he's going to really focus on how a well-rounded life is a life that finds true satisfaction in life. Chapter 13 is going to really focus on how a well-rounded life finds true balance in life. And then the 14th chapter focuses on how our time is spent well when we have a well-rounded life. And so let's start in chapter 12, where he focuses on true satisfaction. And he begins and he says that for the well-rounded life, for the truly satisfied person, it starts in the home, in a righteous home. And that's verses 1 through 11. And right away, in the righteous home, the place that it starts is with me. The way that I act and the things that I do really make a difference inside of my home. And so in the first 3 verses, he says that I'm the kind of person that I am, that first of all, I love instruction, verse 1, that I love the instruction of God's word and that what it teaches me and shapes me to be. But more than that, even that I could, as Solomon speaks to his son here, I could love the instruction of those who live with me. And sometimes it's the hardest thing, isn't it, to take constructive criticism from people. We just want to be right about things, right? We just want to know what's going on. And sometimes people mean well and they say good things and we just aren't open to hearing it. But the home becomes a more righteous place when we are willing to take that constructive criticism from each other, when we're willing to hear what other people have to say and really consider, maybe they're right about that. Second, that it's a place where I am seeking to please God, not to please the people that I live with before God, but to please God first. Not to please myself, but to please God first. And that's verse 2, a good man obtains favor from the Lord. And then third, that I'm seeking to do the right thing from verse 3, that when I do the right things in the home, that's going to create a better place where I can help other people do that too. But of course, the people that I live with matter, and that's what he describes in verses 4 through 11, that if we live with people, verse 4, our spouse and the way that they act, that matters. And of course, he talks about the wife here, but it goes both ways, doesn't it? That the people that we've chosen to be our spouse matters. The people that we receive criticism or instruction from, they're starting in verse 5, he describes those people sorry, my brain just kind of went flat for a minute there, but it's the relationship that we have with one another, and sometimes the people that we live with, they don't give good advice. Right? Earlier we talked about when they do. Sometimes the people we live with are not giving good advice, and you think, well, what if my house is like that? What if I live with people who don't encourage me to do the right thing, who don't encourage me to go in the right direction? And that's true for some people. Thank God that he gave us the church. And that's the New Testament is described as the church is a family. And it's a family because sometimes our families, they don't care about the things that we care about. And so if we don't have that at home, look at all these people. We can find it in abundance here. The counsel and the encouragement and the wisdom, the correction sometimes, the constructive criticism that we need, that can be found here if we don't find it at home. And then just the idea that everybody in the home is really focused on the same goals. They're really focused on the same thing. Sometimes our homes become so busy that it seems like we just pass each other through it. And we go this way and dad goes that way, and we've got to get the kids to this and that and all these things, and those things are fine in and of themselves, but sometimes we become so busy that it's like we don't even know each other anymore as we pass through our homes. And he describes it here, this idea that when we are having the same goal, our relationships with one another, starting in verse 9. And notice verse 11, he says, "He who tills the land will be satisfied with bread." Think about it this way. In ancient times, when people were mostly farmers, why did they have so many kids? Because they all had to work together to be able to survive. They all had to work together for that goal of putting bread on the table, of having something to eat. And the family was glued together by that. People bond more over working together than even over playing together. Entertainment is important, but people bond even greater. I think we probably saw that yesterday with the Ladies' Day that we had, and the bonding that can come when people come together to do work is even greater. And so families, as much as they can, they should find opportunities to work together. And not that you all go to the same office building, but you do things in the home that everyone has their part to play. Everyone has their chores that they fill. Everybody has a role, and it's all a part of the same goals and all a part of the same plan, so that you become unified, you become glued together. This is where a truly satisfying home would feel like, a place where people can find that kind of righteousness and satisfaction. Second, he says, it's a righteous tongue. Now, I think in almost every chapter of Proverbs, Solomon addresses the tongue, because the tongue, maybe more than almost anything else, has the ability to either derail your sense of satisfaction or put you on the right track to satisfaction. And so he's going to address the tongue over and over again. And that's why James in chapter 3, he describes the tongue as such a little thing that can turn whole ships or set whole forests on fire. The tongue is very powerful. And so he tells us our words are either a trap that we fall into, or a fertilizer, something that helps things to grow and to be built up. Notice he describes it starting in verse 12. He says, "The wicked covet the catch of evil men, but the root of righteous yields fruit," right? Something that fertilizes, that helps things to grow. And so this is the same idea of Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29, he tells us that every word we speak should not be corrupt, but it should be something that builds, that edifies, that encourages people. And so he tells us that this is about our listening skills. Verse 15, he says, "The way of the fool is right in his own eyes." Sometimes we feel so sure about something. Have you ever done this? You just felt so sure, and then later you look back and I have no idea what I was talking about. The way of the fool won't listen. They won't consider. But verse 15, he says that he who heeds counsel is wise. Listening skills in the home are very important. He says that we know what to say in verses 17 to 22. And what to say, the main focus that he has in 17 to 22 on what to say is say honest things. Be honest when you speak. Don't speak lies. God is a God who cannot lie. And he does not instruct us to lie because that's contrary to his very nature. And so he says, not deception and lies, but if you choose to say something honest. Now, that doesn't mean you have to say every honest thing that you think of, right? There's a time and a place, and that's what he says in verse 23, right? Know when to say it. A prudent man conceals knowledge, but the heart of fools proclaims foolishness. Now, concealing knowledge, that's not the idea that I know something and you don't know, and I'm going to dangle it over you and feel superior. Right? It's sometimes you know something, or you have an honest thing to say, but you just know this is not the right moment for it. This is not the opportunity for it. We're going to look for that down the road. And so if you're going to say something, right, make sure you've listened. You notice how he put listening before the speaking? That you've listened first. Say something honest and know when to say nothing at all. And then third, he tells us, it's a righteous mind. All of your actions, they start right here. All of your actions start with what you feel and what you think. And so he tells us in verses 24 to 28 that it's a righteous mind will lead to a hard work, he says, will lead to labor. Verse 24, the hand of the diligent will rule. Diligent, someone who when they have energy, and sometimes we just don't have energy, do we? But when they have energy, they're putting it to good use. But the lazy man, you've got to force him to labor. Right? Verse 27, the lazy man does not roast what he took in hunting. Right now, I think Steve could teach a whole sermon on this line right here, probably. That right? You go hunting and you kill it, and then you just leave it and you do nothing with it. Right? How wasteful is that? But he says on the diligence is man's precious possession, a precious possession, not things, but the ability to take the energy you have and do something useful with it. We're going to talk about more on that just a little bit later, but it leads to hard work. It leads to a positive mindset. Verse 25, anxiety in the heart of man causes depression, but a good word makes it glad. What leads people down that dark road? He says, anxiety. That's the idea of distraction. You get distracted by something that you have no control over. You get to thinking about something that you can't actually make a difference or change in. You get worrying about something that's not in your power in this moment to do something about. He says, that's just going to lead you down that dark road. But what makes a heart glad, he says? A good word. He says that there's hard things going on, but you're finding the good in those things. You're focused. You have a positive mindset, right? That's going to lead to the right kind of mind that leads to a truly satisfying life. I'm convinced most people are not satisfied with their life because they spend too much time thinking about things that they can't change and worrying about them. It's the opposite of satisfaction. It's the right kind of friends, verse 26. A righteous should choose his friends carefully so he's not led astray by the wicked. And it's the belief that it's all going to work out. Verse 28. And the way of righteousness is life, and in its pathway there is no death. It is the best path forward, even when it doesn't quite understand for us how. We just trust. God knows what's best. And we trust that, and we follow it forward. That's a truly satisfying life. Now, chapter 13 is about balance. And I think this is, the words of Solomon, as ancient as they are, it feels sometimes like they're written to us today, because these are the things that people crave today. They crave to feel satisfied. They crave to feel like they have some purpose and meaning in their life. And we all, I think, crave balance. In a society where we tend to run too hard and too fast and too much, we tend to overbook our time and go to too many places, and we watch YouTube videos about how to find more balance in our lives and figure out how to make things a little less chaotic. And here's what Solomon has to say about true balance in Proverbs chapter 13. First of all, you cannot have true balance without humility. Humility is a key aspect in true balance. And think about it this way, maybe. Why is it sometimes that you are too busy? Is it because you have to be too busy? Or sometimes, maybe, is it pride? Well, nobody else can do this as good as I can do it. Nobody else can do this. I'm the only one that knows how to do this. If I'm not the one to do it, sometimes pride can be the reason why we won't let things go. Or we like the feeling of having a long checklist. I can be this way. I like the feeling of being busy. It makes me feel important. It makes me feel like I belong somewhere. Sometimes pride is the reason why we don't have balance in our lives. And so he says humility is essential. He describes it and he says, first of all, there's the humility to listen more than we speak. And he's going to bring this up often. He says, a wise son heeds his father's instructions. A man shall eat well by the fruit of his mouth. But verse 3, he who guards his mouth preserves his life. He who opens wide his lips shall have destruction. In other words, you can say too many things. Sometimes we just talk to hear ourselves talk or to fill the silence. And he says, the more that you talk, the more likely you're going to enter into the realm of sin with your words. And so it says there's value in that. It's humility as well in our perspectives. And he starts this in verse 4. In verse 4, and he talks about our perspective. And he's going to give us perspective on true true wealth? What is the wealth that is really valuable to us? And of course, he's going to describe spiritual wealth. He starts in verse 4 and he says, the soul of a lazy man desires and has nothing. Right? He wants things, but he doesn't do anything about it. But the soul of the diligent shall be made rich. Now, do you notice what he said there? He didn't say the man will be made rich. He said his soul will be made rich. Right? We're talking about spiritual wealth, not physical wealth. His soul will be made rich. And he says that money is not all that it seems to be. Verse 7, he says there is one who makes himself rich, yet he has nothing. Right? This is the great cliche. You find it in the movies all the time. The wealthy, rich person who lives in his giant house all by himself and has nobody to love and no one to care about her. And that's true sometimes. We can be so focused on accumulating things and money that we cut people out of our lives. We don't make time for people. We have nothing. But he says in verse 7, the one who makes himself poor yet has great riches. The person who didn't work all of that overtime, and so they did not make as much money, but they had time at home with their kids and with their family. The person who she let go of that job because they were asking her to do something dishonest, and she had to take a much lower paying job, but she's following in the footsteps of Christ. She's doing the right things. That's true riches. The person who, they turned down that big promotion where they could have made more money, but look at all that they gained because they had the time in their life to do it. Spiritual wealth is what pays in the end. And that's what he says starting in verse 9. He says, the light of the righteous rejoices. There's joy in spiritual wealth. Verse 10, he says there's wisdom that comes in spiritual wealth. Verses 11 and 12, he says it's worth the labor. At verse 11, wealth gained by dishonesty will be diminished, but he who gathers by labor will increase. And so certainly physical wealth at times is worth the labor to a degree. But then verse 12, he says hope deferred makes the heart sick. Why do people usually obtain wealth by dishonest means? It's because they don't want to wait, right? This is hope deferred. They don't want to wait for whatever it is that they want. So they'll cut corners or they'll lie to make more money. But he says, hope deferred, it makes the heart sick, doesn't it? You feel like you're going to die if you don't get it today. But when the desire comes, it is a tree of life. If we are gathering by labor and increasing, if we're able to wait to have whatever it is until we can afford it, and that's true of physical wealth, but it's especially true when it comes to spiritual wealth, that when we receive it, when we finally have that wisdom that it's just not clicked before, but there it is, or when we finally have that understanding or the ability to overcome that temptation, it's a tree of life, and it leads us closer and closer to that eternal tree of life where we want to end up being someday. True wealth comes from God's word. That's what verses 13 through 19 describes. It says, true wealth, starting in verse 13, it says, he who despises the word will be destroyed, but he who fears the commandments will be rewarded. The law of the wise is a fountain of life, to turn away from the snares of death. And so he says in verse 15, he says we should love that word. Sorry, that's verses 13 through 14. Love God's word. Verse 15, he says understand God's word. And verse 16, he says to live God's word. 17, he says teach God's word to people. And then verses 18 through 19, he says keep it. Keep and protect and obey God's word. That's where true spiritual wealth is going to come from. And then true spiritual wealth comes from our relationships with people. It comes from the friends that we have. Verse 20, he who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companions of fools will be destroyed. Evil pursues sinners, but to the righteous good shall be repaid. Right? The people we spend most of our time with will determine what kind of wealth that we are gaining. And it comes with how we provide for others, how we take care of other people. He says in verse 22, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Now this is not a command. Some people can't afford to leave an inheritance to their grandchildren, but he describes the great blessing that comes with that. And I imagine that maybe in the back of his mind, there's the idea that a good man leaves a spiritual inheritance to his children's children, and that he is passing these things down through the generations, as Solomon is trying to do as he writes this. And so it's something that he's provided for people. He describes in verse 24, he says they've provided discipline. He who spares his rod hates his child, but he who loves and disciplines him, and notice it says this, disciplines him promptly. I saw it, and we need to take care of this so that you learn the lesson today. It's like puppies, If you try to discipline puppies hours after they did something wrong, they have no idea they don't learn anything from that. Children, especially young children, are kind of like that too. And so it's I love you enough to pay attention. I love you enough to notice these things and to discipline so that we work all of these things out. And so this is true balance. And notice what the focus is on. The focus is on who we are, on our humility, on our perspective, on how we're pouring into God's word so that it changes our life, and how we're pouring into relationships so that we change others' lives and they change us. That true balance is pulling back and saying, is all of my time spent just in pursuing the material, or is it in pursuing spiritual things and relationships with people? And when we focus on pursuing spiritual things and relationships with people, that's where we find true balance. Now, that doesn't mean we all quit our jobs and we don't ever go to work. But there's spiritual things that we do at work, and we'll see that in the next chapter, that, even making decisions is spiritual work, and we do that all the time, no matter where we are. But that whatever we do, that's how we see it. We see it as spiritual work, that we're making decisions that impact where we go and where other people go to. Chapter 14 is about true productivity, right? How we spend our time. And really the point that he makes here, he says, don't be busy, right? Don't just be busy, be productive. And there is a difference, and I'll be the first to tell you, I know firsthand the difference between just being busy. Right? It feels good to mentally check things off of a list for some of us, It feels good to just say, I accomplished that, and I accomplished that. But you go on, and if you're just doing things just to be busy, eventually you start to feel very empty, because there's not a lot of reason, there's not a lot of meaning behind it. And so he says, don't just be busy. Right? Don't just fill your schedule for the sake of it, but do things that are really worth it. Do things that are productive. That's for our actions, and as we pointed out, Solomon emphasizes, for our words, that even our words should not just be busy, they should be productive. He says in verse 1, he says, the wise woman builds her house, but the foolish pulls it down with her hands. And you think, who goes outside and starts pulling the siding or the bricks off of it? Nobody does that. He's not talking about literally pulling it down. He's saying the way that we spend our time in the home is either building up the people and building up the home, or it's pulling the home down and it's tearing it apart. And he says that's true of our actions, verse 2, that we walk in righteousness and fear the Lord. And it's true of our words, verse 3. In the mouth of the fool is a rod of pride, but the lips of the wise will preserve them. How do you build your home up? It's choosing the right actions and the right kinds of words. And so what is worth spending your time on? What's something that's productive? Verses 4 through 14, he tells us it's worth it to seek truth. That's true, of course, of God's word, just true generally in life, trying to seek. We live in a world where there are sometimes more lies told than there are truths. We live in a world where we're told that the earth is billions and billions of years old and that it just accidentally came into being. We live in a world where we're told that you can't really know for sure anything, not even what gender you are, things like that. And so seeking truth in every aspect of that word is something that is worth spending time in. Right? He says in verses 4 through 5, honesty is worth it. And this is how he describes it. He says, honesty is worth the muck. Right? That's what he says in verse 4. He says, where no oxen are, the trough is clean, but much increase comes by the strength of an ox. In other words, we had horses when I was a kid, and sometimes I just hated, mucking out the stalls. It just, it's a lot of work. But he's saying, well, that's pain. Imagine if you lived back then, trying to plow your field if you didn't have oxen, trying to get your cart to town if you didn't have oxen. What they provide is worth the little bit of time you spend mucking out their stalls. But he's not really talking about oxen as much as verse 5. He says, a faithful witness does not lie. A false witness will utter lie. Seeking truth, that's what's worth the muck. Sometimes it's difficult and it's dirty work to find the truth, but he says it's worth it to do that. He goes on and he describes in seeking knowledge, we need to seek it from the right people, right? Not from fools. And that's verses 6 through 9. Right? The scoffer seeks wisdom. He does not find it. Because when he finds it, he scoffs at it. He didn't really want it. The knowledge is easy to him who understands, who will really consider it and learn and grow. And so he says, right, don't seek it from the wrong people. You can't get it from strangers. That comes from verse 10. Right? The heart knows its own bitterness. A stranger does not share its joy. In other words, you've got to be friends with people. You've got to make friends if they're going to tell you what they know, what they have learned through life. And then he says, seek it from the upright. Verse 11, the house of the wicked will be overthrown, but the tent of the upright will flourish. If you want to flourish in your life, if you want to have all of the growth and the benefit that God provides, he says, look to above, look to God and his word and the people who love his word, the people who know his word. Seek truth from them and you will flourish in your life. And then he says, seek it with the right pair of glasses on. This is verses 12 through 14. Verses 12 through 14, he says, things are not always as they seem. Right? Verse 12, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its way is the end of death. Sometimes we are so focused on our feelings or so focused on our assumptions that we're walking down the wrong path. And he says we should question those things and ask, do they match truth? Do they match evidence? Do they match something tangible that can lead me in a solid direction that I can count on? And so here are his examples. He says in verse 13, he says, even in laughter, the heart may sorrow, and the end of mirth may be grief. And so everybody wants to laugh, but sometimes the things that we're laughing about end up making us feel sad at the end of it. Have you ever done that? You thought, I shouldn't have laughed about that. That's terrible, isn't it? Or so sometimes that we're laughing, but he says grief is what comes of it. What we're laughing about or who we're laughing or making fun of or things like that they can end the wrong way because we were just trusting our feelings or just trusting our assumptions. He says in verse 14, the backslider in heart will be filled with his own ways. That is, he's proud. He looks confident. When he walks down the street, people think that's a guy who knows what he's talking about, right? He's got all the money. He's got all the clout. He's got all the respect of the people. He's confident, but he's full of himself. He says he's proud. He's backsliding. He looks like he's going where you want to go. He's actually sliding the way that you don't want to go. And then he says, but a good man will be satisfied from above. Right? And so these are his examples. Things are not always as they seem. And that's why we shouldn't just jump into things. We should seek what's the truth about this situation. And ultimately, it's because spiritual work is what brings God's blessings. It brings the safest path. Verse 15, the simple believes every word. They're easily led anywhere. But the prudent considers well his steps. He wants to know for sure where he's putting his step. And so where's the evidence? Where's the truth here? And he says, if he seeks these things, then he will be blessed. He will find true friends in verses 20 to 21. The poor man is hated even by his own neighbor, but the rich man has many friends, right? That's the way that the world is. But verse 21, he says, the truth of the matter is, he who despises his neighbor sins, but he who has mercy on the poor, happy is he. Right? True friends aren't just there for you when you have all the things. They're there for when you have nothing. That's what we find when we do spiritual work. We find true friends who will be there for us through the thick and through the thin. It says we find true wealth, verses 22 to 25, that do they not go astray who devise evil, but mercy and truth is something that belongs to those who devise good. He says, in all labor there is profit. That's true wealth, but idle chatter leads only to poverty. He says, The crown of the wise is their riches, right? Wisdom is their riches. Wisdom is the wealth that they have, but the foolishness of fools is folly. And he says we'll find true health in verse 30. A sound heart is life to the body. I love that. It's a sound heart. That's healthy decisions. Healthy decisions, he says, are life to the body. Right? That when you are making healthy decisions, it's not just good for you spiritually, it's good for you physically. And that's because healthy decisions, and we're not talking just about, what you eat and what you drink and things like that, every kind of decision. That's because you will make better health decisions, but more than that, when we make unhealthy decisions, we add stress to our life. And look this up on the internet, and you can read all about what stress does to our health, the ways that stress tear our health down. But when we make healthy decisions, we relieve some of that stress from our lives, and we can be and become healthier physically as well. And so it's true health and ultimately true security. Verses 31 to 35. True security, he who oppresses the poor reproaches his maker. God is not, that person is not secure in God. Who honors him has mercy of the needy. The wicked is banished in his wickedness. The righteous has refuge. He's protected in his death even. Even at death, the worst thing that most people can think of. Protection, he says. Wisdom rests in the heart of him who has understanding, but what is in the heart of the fool is made known. Righteousness exalts a nation. When we do the right thing, we benefit all the people who are around us. Sin is a reproach. The king's favor is toward a wise servant. Right? If you have the king's favor, you have protection. Of course, God is our king. We have protection from him. When we seek after that wisdom that Solomon talks about so much, when we desire the fear of the Lord and long to know all that God's wisdom has to offer us, we find ourselves more and more securely in the protection and the security that God offers us. True satisfaction, true balance, true growth in life, those come from the decisions that we make, the mindsets that we have, and of course, Proverbs could have been a 12, 24, 92-hour long sermon. There's so much depth to them. And so I encourage you to spend time in them and really contemplate and meditate and think about them, because they are very deep, each one, as well as how they connect with one another. Spend time in those. Seek the true wealth that God offers. Grow in wisdom. And if we can help you do that this morning, we ask that you come forward as we stand and as we sing.